They told me to sell it for scrap. My cousin Ray laughed in my face, kicked the rusted tire of Grandpa's 1978 Massey Ferguson, and said, "That tractor is worthless, Brian. Just like this farm is going to be when I'm done with it." He thought he had won. He thought the legal battle was over, and the land was his to pave over for a strip mall. But Ray didn't know Grandpa Earl, and he definitely didn't know that inside that greasy, seized-up engine block lay a secret that would flip our entire town upside down. This isn't just a story about a tractor. It's a story about greed, betrayal, and the 40-year-old promise hidden inside a piston that changed everything. The air in the lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and lemon polish, a scent Brian Bennett would forever associate with bad news. It was the hottest July on record in Oakhaven County, and the air conditioning in the Henderson and Associates building was rattling, fighting a losing battle against the humidity. Brian sat on one side of the mahogany conference table, his hands calloused and stained with the faint, permanent grease of a mechanic. He pulled at the collar of his only suit, a charcoal grey number he'd bought for a cousin's wedding 5 years ago. It was tight in the shoulders now. Across from him sat Ray. Ray Bennett didn't look like he came from the same gene pool, let alone the same grandfather. While Brian was broad, sunburned, and rough-hewn, Ray was sleek. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Brian's truck. He was typing something on his phone, the clicking of his manicured thumbnails against the glass, the only sound in the room, besides the air conditioner's wheeze. "Gentleman Mr. Henderson," said, shuffling a stack of papers. He was a man who looked like he was made of parchment paper, thin, dry, and easily crumpled. "As you know, your grandfather, Earl Bennett, was particular." "Eccentric is the word you're looking for," Henderson Ray said, without looking up from his phone. "Just get to the asset division. I have a flight to Chicago at 6. Brian clenched his jaw. Grandpa Earl hadn't been eccentric. He'd been tired of watching the family farm bleed Cunny, tired of the developers circling like vultures, and tired of watching Ray, his eldest grandson, treat the family legacy like a portfolio asset to be liquidated. "Very well." Henderson cleared his throat. "The estate is divided as follows. To Raymond Bennett, the eldest grandson, Mr. Earl Bennett leaves the liquid assets totaling $340,000, the stocks in Bennett Logistics, and the terrifyingly specific instruction that he is to receive the easy way out as he always preferred." Ray smirked, finally pocketing his phone. Old man knew me well. Cash is king. Brian felt a pit open in his stomach. He knew the farm was in debt, but he hadn't realized Grandpa had that much cash tucked away. That money could have saved the harvest. It could have fixed the irrigation pivots. And to Brian Regard, Bennett Henderson continued looking over his spectacles with pity. He leaves the deed to the 400 acres known as Bennett Ridge contingent on the payment of all outstanding property taxes and liens within 90 days. 90 days, Brian blurted out. "The taxes alone are $42,000, Ray interrupted, his smile widening. "Plus the bank liens. You're looking at 70 grand by October, Brian. You don't have 70 grand. You don't even have 7 grand. And Henderson raised a finger, silencing them. He leaves Brian the contents of the north barn. Ray laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "The north barn. You mean the graveyard? There's nothing in there but rust and rat droppings." Specifically, Henderson read on the 1978 Massey Ferguson 285 tractor. Earl writes, "It's the only thing on this earth that works as hard as Brian does. If he can make it run, he can make the farm run." The room went silent. "That's it?" Brian asked, his voice hollow. "A debt I can't pay and a broken tractor. "That's the will," Henderson said softly. Ray stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked around the table and placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. It felt heavy, condescending. "Look, Brian, I'm not a monster. I know you love the dirt. But let's be real. That tractor is worthless. The engine is seized. I checked it myself last time I was down. The block is cracked. It's scrap metal." Ray leaned in close, his cologne overpowering the smell of lemon polish. "Sell me the land now. I'll pay off the liens, give you $50,000 for your trouble, and you can walk away. I've got a buyer from a solar energy firm who wants to pave the whole thing. Clean cash. I'm not paving over Grandpa's corn," Brian said, standing up. He towered over Ray. "And I'm not selling." "Suit yourself," Ray shrugged, heading for the door. "But when the county sheriff comes to evict you in 90 days, don't come crying to me. You got the rust bucket, cousin. Enjoy it." 3 hours later, Brian stood in the gloom of the north barn. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old diesel. Shafts of afternoon sunlight pierced through the gaps in the wooden siding, illuminating the hulking silhouette in the center of the room. The Massey Ferguson 285. It was a disaster. The red paint had long since faded to a dull, oxidized pinkish brown. One of the rear tires was completely shredded. The seat was missing half its stuffing, looking like an exploded sponge. But the worst part was the engine. Brian popped the hood. It screeched in protest. Underneath it was a mess of grime oil and neglect. Grandpa hadn't run this thing in 10 years. Ray was right about one thing: it looked like a lost cause. If the block was cracked, the tractor was basically a 2-ton paperweight. Brian ran his hand over the cold metal of the valve cover. "Works as hard as I do, huh?" Brian whispered to the machine. "Grandpa, you old cryptic bastard. What were you thinking?" He grabbed a wrench from his back pocket. He didn't have $70,000. He didn't have a plan. But he had hands that knew how to fix things. And he had a lot of anger. "Worthless." Brian muttered, echoing Ray's words. He cranked the wrench on the first bolt of the exhaust manifold. It didn't budge. He grunted, putting his weight into it. It snapped free with a loud crack that echoed through the empty barn. He was going to fix this tractor, not because he needed it to farm. He had a newer John Deere for that, though the bank technically owned most of it, but because Ray said it was trash. And in the Bennett family, spite was a powerful fuel. Brian didn't know it yet, but that stubborn bolt was the first step toward a discovery that would make the $300,000 Ray inherited look like pocket change. 2 weeks burned away in the heat of July. The 90-day deadline was a ticking clock in the back of Brian's mind, louder than the cicadas screaming in the cottonwoods. The farm was running on fumes. Brian was up at 4 a.m. to tend the irrigation for the soybean crop, and by 7 p.m., when the sun finally began to dip, he was in the north barn. He had become obsessed with the Massey Ferguson. It wasn't just a repair job anymore. It was a war. Every bolt fought him. Every gasket was fused to the metal. He had busted his knuckles so many times, his hands looked like raw meat. His neighbor, old man Noah Miller, stopped by on a Tuesday evening with a casserole his wife Martha had made. Noah leaned against the barn door, chewing on a toothpick, watching Brian wrestle with the radiator. "You know, Brian," Noah drawled, "Ray's been asking around town about the zoning laws. He's telling people at the diner that the solar deal is already done." Brian didn't look up. He wiped sweat from his eyes with a greasy forearm. "Ray likes the sound of his own voice." "He's saying you're broke," Noah said gently. "Saying you're just playing in the dirt until the sheriff shows up." Brian stopped. He dropped the wrench. It clattered against the concrete. "Let him talk, Noah. Unless he's got a check for $70,000, I don't care what he says. He's family Brian. But he's got shark blood. Just watch your back. People do crazy things when land values go up. After Noah left, the silence of the barn felt heavier. Brian looked at the tractor. He had stripped it down to the essentials. The radiator was out. The alternator was on the workbench. Now he had to deal with the engine block. Ray had said the block was cracked. If that was true, the tractor was dead. Brian set up his work light, the harsh halogen glare illuminating the side of the Perkins diesel engine. He grabbed a wire brush and a bottle of degreaser. He needed to clean the side of the block to inspect it for fissures. He scrubbed for an hour. The layers of grease were geological decades of oil leaks, mixed with Nebraska dust, baked hard by engine heat. As he scrubbed near the starter motor mount, something felt wrong. Usually the cast iron of an engine block is rough-textured from the sand casting process. But under his wire brush, Brian felt a patch of metal that was perfectly smooth, too smooth. He frowned, leaning in closer. He sprayed more degreaser, the chemical smell stinging his nose. He scrubbed harder, the wire bristles scratching away the black sludge. What the hell? It wasn't a crack. It was a seam. There was a rectangular plate bolted onto the side of the engine block, just behind where the starter motor sat. It had been painted over with engine enamel, and then buried under years of grease, making it look like part of the casting. But now that it was clean, Brian could see the faint outline. It was roughly 4 inches by 6 inches. It didn't belong there. There was no mechanical reason for an access plate in that location on a Perkins engine. It led right into the water jacket or the cylinder walls. Brian's heart started to hammer against his ribs. He grabbed a smaller socket wrench. There were 4 bolts holding the plate, but the heads had been filed down almost flat to make them invisible. Grandpa Brian whispered. What did you do? He had to use a pair of vice grips to lock onto the rounded bolt heads. He strained his biceps, trembling. The first bolt turned with a screech of rusted threads, then the second. It took him 40 minutes to get all 4 out. His hands were shaking now. The heat in the barn seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold chill of anticipation. He tapped the edge of the plate with a hammer. Clink. It fell onto the concrete. Brian shone the work light into the hole. It wasn't an opening into the engine's machinery. It was a hollowed-out cavity. The cast iron of the block had been modified, a false chamber created where solid metal should have been. Inside the small dark space, wrapped in oil-soaked canvas, was a metal cylinder. It looked like an old thermos, or perhaps a shell casing, from a large artillery round, capped at both ends. Brian reached in. His fingers brushed the cold metal. He pulled it out. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. He carried it over to the workbench, clearing away the scattered tools. He unwrapped the oily canvas. Underneath the cylinder was brass, untarnished and gleaming. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a chaotic mess of spare parts. It was a capsule. One end was screwed on tight. Brian clamped the cylinder in his bench vise, wrapping it in a rag to protect the brass. He used a pipe wrench on the cap. Kriak! The cap spun off. Brian tipped the cylinder over. He expected papers, maybe the real will. Maybe a confession that Grandpa had a second family in Idaho. What slid out onto the workbench wasn't paper. First, a small, heavy velvet pouch tumbled out. Then a roll of what looked like blueprints, brittle and yellowed. And finally, a single photograph. Brian picked up the photograph first. It was black and white, dated 1968. It showed a younger Grandpa Earl shaking hands with a man in a military uniform. They were standing in front of a truck, but not a farm truck. It looked like a prototype, something futuristic for the 60s. He opened the velvet pouch. Diamonds, gold coins, namaudrere. Inside was a key, a complex tubular key that looked like it belonged to a bank vault or a nuclear silo. It had a tag attached to it with a string. On the tag, in Grandpa Earl's distinct, jagged handwriting, was a set of coordinates and a single word, Goliath. Brian stared at the key. Then he unrolled the blueprints. They were schematics, but not for a tractor. They were labeled U.S. Department of Defense, Project Horizon, classification, top secret. Brian stepped back, his boot crunching on a stray washer. The silence of the barn was deafening. Grandpa Earl wasn't just a farmer. Ray had called the tractor worthless. Ray had called the farm a dead end. But Grandpa had hidden something in the heart of this tractor that the U.S. government had apparently been working on 50 years ago. Brian's phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. He pulled it out. It was a text from Ray. Change of plans. Bringing the surveyor by tomorrow morning. Be ready to open the gates. Brian looked at the text, then at the top-secret blueprints, then at the strange key. You're not coming through those gates, Ray, Brian said to the empty room. Not tomorrow. Not ever. But just as he reached for the blueprints to roll them back up, he heard it. The sound of tires on gravel. Slow, heavy. Not a surveyor. It was pitch black outside. Brian killed the work light, plunging the barn into darkness. He held his breath. A car door slammed. Then another. I'm telling you, I saw a light, a voice hissed. It wasn't Ray. It was a voice Brian didn't recognize, rough, deep, and dangerous. Check the barn. If the hillbilly is in there, scare him. But find the engine. Brian froze. They weren't here for the land. They were here for the tractor. And they knew about the engine. He grabbed the brass cylinder, the blueprints and the key, and scrambled into the shadows behind the stacked hay bales, just as the barn door creaked open. The darkness in the north barn was not absolute. It was a textured gloom sliced into ribbons by the moonbeams filtering through the warped siding. But now those passive ribbons of light were overpowered by the violent, searching glare of tactical flashlights. Brian pressed his back against the rough wood of the hayloft ladder. He was crouched behind a wall of square, baled alfalfa that smelled of sweet, dry summer and decay. His heart wasn't just beating. It was colliding with his ribs, a frantic rhythm that he felt sure the men below could hear. He clutched the brass cylinder to his chest with one hand, his other hand gripping a heavy iron pry bar he'd snagged from a tool bucket on his way into the shadows. Clear right, a voice said. It was the same voice he'd heard outside, rough deep like gravel, tumbling in a dryer. Clear left, a second voice replied. This one was lighter, sharper. Professional. Brian peered through a gap between the bales. He could see them now, two silhouettes moving with practiced precision. They didn't walk like farmers, heavy-footed and tired. They moved like hunters, rolling their feet from heel to toe to silence their steps on the concrete. The first man, the heavy one, was sweeping his light across the workbench. The beam danced over the disassembled alternator, the scattered wrenches, and the pool of oil where Brian had been working just minutes ago. Engine is still warm, the heavy man said. He touched the block of the Massey Ferguson. Heat coming off the work light, too. He was just here. The second man, the one Brian mentally tagged as the leader, walked slowly around the tractor. He wore a dark windbreaker and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't look at the mess on the floor. He looked directly at the engine block. He stopped at the spot where the starter motor had been. He shone his light into the hole where the secret plate had been removed. Damn it, the leader hissed. The sound was like a snake striking in the quiet barn. Look at this, Kane. Kane, the heavy one, lumbered over. The flashlight beam illuminated the exposed cavity in the cast iron. Empty Kane grunted. He found the chamber, the leader said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. He found the cylinder. And since the truck outside is cold, that means he's on foot. The leader turned, and for a split second, His flashlight beam swept up toward the hayloft. Brian ducked, squeezing his eyes shut, praying the dust motes wouldn't catch the light and give him away. "You think he knows what he has?" Kane asked. "He's a dirt farmer, Kane. He thinks he found a time capsule or a stash of gold coins. He has no idea he's holding the keystones to $1 billion energy patent. But ignorance makes him dangerous. If he opens it, if he loses that key—" The leader paused. "Search the perimeter. If he's in here, hurt him. But do not kill him until we have the cylinder." The client was specific. "No loose ends, but the asset comes first." The client? Brian's mind raced. Was it Ray? No. Ray was greedy, a corporate climber who wanted to sell land for strip malls. This was different. These men were talking about patents and assets. This was something far bigger than a zoning dispute. He had to get out. The barn had 2 exits. The main sliding double doors at the front, which were currently blocked by the men and their vehicle, and a small waist-high service door at the back, used for mucking out stalls in the old days. The service door was 30 feet away behind the tractor. Brian looked at the pry bar in his hand. He looked at the brass cylinder. He needed a distraction. Below him, Kane was kicking over piles of burlap sacks near the grain bins. The leader was moving toward the ladder. Brian's eyes darted around the loft. He was next to the old hay drop, a square hole in the floor used to toss bales down to the cattle. Directly below the hole was the gravity wagon, a rusted metal hopper filled with scrap metal. Brian had been meaning to recycle for 3 years. Old brake rotors, jagged sheet metal, heavy iron chains. The leader put a hand on the ladder. The wood creaked. Brian didn't hesitate. He reached for a loose 50-pound salt lick block sitting on a pallet near the edge. It was solid as a rock. He timed it. 1, 2. He shoved the salt block through the hay drop. It plummeted 12 feet and smashed into the pile of scrap metal in the gravity wagon below. Clang crash. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, like a grenade going off in a tin can. It sounded like a man falling or a piece of heavy machinery collapsing. Back, the leader shouted, spinning around and leveling a weapon, a pistol with a suppressor, toward the gravity wagon. Both flashlight beams converged on the back corner of the barn. Brian moved. He didn't climb down the ladder. That was too slow. He vaulted over the side of the loft, dropping 10 feet onto the stacked bags of fertilizer near the front wall. He hit with a soft thud, the plastic bags absorbing the impact. Though a jolt of pain shot up his shins, he scrambled to his feet, keeping the tractor between him and the men. "It's just scrap." Kane yelled, his voice echoing from the back corner. "Nobody's there. He's moving, the leader." Screamed. Front wall. A beam of light slashed through the darkness, missing Brian's head by inches. Brian lunged for the service door. It was stuck, warped by decades of humidity. He slammed his shoulder into it. Thud. It didn't budge. There. A flashlight pinned him against the wood. He was blinded. Stop! Kane roared, his footsteps thundering across the concrete. Brian roared back, adrenaline flooding his veins. He raised his boot and kicked the latch with everything he had. The rusted metal groaned, then snapped. The door flew open, spilling him out into the cool night air. He scrambled onto the dirt, the tall grass slapping his face. Foot. A sound like a staple gun. A splinter of wood from the doorframe exploded next to his ear. They were shooting. Brian didn't look back. He ran. He ran blindly into the cornfield that bordered the barn, the 7-foot stalks swallowing him whole. The corn leaves whipped at his arms and face like razors. He zigzagged, crashing through the rows, his breath tearing at his throat. Behind him he heard the barn door slam open, but the flashlight beams couldn't penetrate the dense wall of green. "Fan out," a voice shouted from the barn. "He can't go far." But they were wrong. Brian knew this cornfield. He had planted it. He knew every dip in the terrain, every irrigation ditch. He ran until his lungs burned, until the sounds of the men faded into the chirping of crickets. He collapsed near the creek bed, at the south edge of the property, a mile from the house. He curled up in the mud, clutching the brass cylinder to his chest, trembling uncontrollably. He was alone. He was hunted, and inside his jacket was the only thing that could explain why his grandfather, a simple corn farmer, had died with military secrets buried in his tractor. The farmhouse of Noah Miller was a fortress of solitude in a changing world. While other neighbors had sold out to developers or upgraded to modern vinyl-sided boxes, Noah lived in the same stone and timber house his great-grandfather had built in 1910. It was 11:30 p.m. when Brian pounded on the heavy oak back door. He was covered in mud, bleeding from a scratch on his cheek, and his eyes were wide with a primal kind of fear. The porch light flickered on. The door opened a crack held by a chain. Noah's weathered face appeared illuminated by the warm glow of the kitchen. He was wearing a plaid robe and held a double-barreled shotgun loosely in one hand, barrel pointed at the floor, but ready. Brian Noah unhooked the chain immediately. "Boy, you look like you've been dragged through a thresher backwards. Get in here." Brian stumbled into the kitchen. It smelled of pipe tobacco and dried sage. It was a smell of safety, of old-world stability. Brian collapsed into one of the wooden chairs at the round table. Noah locked the door, threw the deadbolt, and then shut the heavy velvet drapes over the window. He didn't ask questions yet. He went to the cupboard, pulled out a bottle of amber liquid, and poured a generous glass. "Drink," Noah commanded. Brian drank. The whiskey burned, grounding him. Now Noah said, sitting opposite him, the shotgun resting on his knees, "Tell me why you're running through my fields in the middle of the night instead of sleeping." Brian reached into his jacket. He pulled out the brass cylinder. He set it on the table. Noah went still. The old man's eyes, usually watery and kind, sharpened into something hard. He stared at the brass tube as if it were a venomous snake he hadn't seen in 40 years, but remembered perfectly. "Where did you find this?" Noah asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Inside the tractor," Brian said, his voice raspy. "Inside the engine block of the Massey Ferguson. Grandpa Earl hid it there." Noah closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. "Earl! You stubborn old mule! You actually did it!" Did what Brian demanded, leaning forward. "Noah, 2 men just tried to kill me in my own barn. They had suppressors on their guns. They knew about the engine. They knew about the cylinder. Who are they? And what is this?" Noah reached out and touched the cylinder with a trembling finger. "Did you open it?" "Yes. There's a key inside. And blueprints, labeled Project Horizon." Noah nodded slowly. He stood up and walked to the fireplace. He picked up a framed photo from the mantelpiece. Brian had seen it 100 times, a grainy black and white photo of a platoon of soldiers in Korea. But Noah didn't look at that one. He reached behind it and pulled out a smaller hidden snapshot. He tossed it onto the table in front of Brian. It was a picture of 3 men standing in front of a massive hangar-like structure in the Nevada desert. The year stamped on the border was 1971. On the left was a young Noah, lean and muscular. In the middle was Earl Bennett, Brian's grandfather, holding a wrench and grinning. And on the right was a man in a suit, looking uncomfortable in the desert heat. "You knew," Brian whispered. "I didn't just know, Brian." "I was there," Noah said, sitting back down heavily. "Everyone in Oakhaven thinks Earl and I just served in Korea together. But that wasn't the end of it. After the war, we were contractors, civilian logistics. We drove heavy haulers for the Department of Defense." Noah poured himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. In the late 60s, the Cold War was freezing over. The government was terrified of an energy crisis. They were looking for ways to sustain the country if the oil stopped flowing or if the grid went down. Project Horizon wasn't a weapon, Brian. Not initially. It was a generator. A generator. Brian looked at the small cylinder. That's it, not just a generator. It was a self-sustaining geothermal pulse engine. Infinite torque, infinite power, designed to run agricultural machinery, purify water power hospitals indefinitely. It was supposed to be the thing that saved the American heartland. Noah pointed a calloused finger at the brass cylinder. That cylinder contains the core stabilizer. Without it, the machine is just a pile of junk. With it, it changes the world economy. So why hide it? Brian asked. If it was so good, why didn't they build it? Because of the man on the right. Noah tapped the photo. That's Victor Sterling. He was the corporate liaison. He represented a consortium of oil companies and private defense contractors. When they realized Horizon worked too well that it would make diesel and coal obsolete within a decade, they panicked. They ordered the project scrapped. They wanted the prototypes destroyed and the blueprints burned. Noah looked Brian in the eye. Your grandfather couldn't stand it. He was a farmer at heart. He saw a machine that could free every farmer in America from debt, from fuel costs, from the banks. So the night before the demolition, Earl stole the core. He stole the master key. And he stole the blueprints. Brian felt the room spinning. He stole from the U.S. government. He stole from thieves, Noah corrected. He smuggled it out in a crate of tractor parts. He brought it home. He told me he was going to hide it until the world was ready. Until the vultures died off, he said. But the vultures didn't die off, Brian said, a cold realization washing over him. They just had kids. Ray. Noah nodded grimly. Ray is working with Sterling's company, or whatever it's called now. Vanguard Systems, probably. They've been waiting for Earl to die. They knew he had it, but they didn't know where. They couldn't tear the farm apart while he was alive without drawing attention. But now they have 90 days, Brian finished, or less. Ray is trying to force the sale so they can dig. Dig? Noah frowned. Why would they dig? The tag, Brian said. He fumbled with the cylinder and pulled out the key with the tag attached. It has coordinates, and the word Goliath. Noah took the tag. He squinted at the numbers. He stood up and walked to a map of the county pinned to his kitchen wall. He traced the lines of latitude and longitude with his finger. His finger stopped. He went pale. Where is it? Brian asked. It's on your land, Noah said softly. But it's not near the house. It's the sinkhole. The sinkhole was a depressed acre of land in the far west pasture of Bennett Ridge. It was useless land, rocky, swampy, prone to fog. Grandpa Earl had always forbidden Brian from playing near it, claiming the ground was unstable. Goliath isn't a concept, Brian, Noah said, turning around. Goliath is the machine. Earl didn't just steal the core, he buried the prototype. The whole damn machine is buried under your pasture. The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. They aren't buying the land for a solar farm, Brian realized. They're buying it to excavate Goliath. If Ray signs that deed, they get $1 trillion technology, and I get nothing. And the world stays hooked on their oil. It's worse than that, Noah said. He walked back to the table and picked up the shotgun. If Vanguard gets that machine, they won't use it to help farmers. They'll patent it, lock it away, and sue anyone who tries to invent anything similar. They want to bury the future, Brian. Just like they tried to do 50 years ago. Brian stood up. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. It was the same anger he felt when the bank called the same anger he felt when Ray smirked at his muddy boots. "They're not getting it," Brian said. "I don't care if they have guns. This is Bennett land." "That's brave," Noah said, "but stupid. You can't fight a paramilitary unit with a pry bar." "I don't have to fight them," Brian said, his eyes drifting to the key on the table. "I have the key, and I have the blueprints. I don't need to destroy them. I need to expose them." "How YouTube," Brian said. "The internet, the news. If I can get to the machine, if I can prove it exists and works, they can't hide it anymore. Once the secret is out, they can't kill me without making it a martyrdom." Noah looked skeptical, but a glint of admiration appeared in his eyes. "You want to turn Goliath on. I want to wake the giant up," Brian corrected. Suddenly the phone on the wall rang. It was an old rotary phone, and its shrill bell made both men jump. Noah stared at it. Nobody called at midnight. He picked it up. Miller Residence. He listened for a moment, his face tightening. He hung up without saying a word. "Who was it?" Brian asked. "That was the sheriff," Noah said. "He's looking for you. He says there was a report of a disturbance at your barn. He says you set fire to it, Brian." Brian ran to the window and peered through the crack in the drapes. In the distance across the fields, a pillar of orange flame was rising into the night sky. The north barn, Grandpa's barn. The tractor. Everything was burning. "They're framing me," Brian said, his voice shaking. "They're burning me out. They're flushing you out," Noah said, racking the slide on his shotgun. "They know you ran. They know you're scared. They expect you to run to the police. But the police are already bought." Noah grabbed a set of keys from a hook. "We're not waiting for the sheriff," Noah said. "Grab the blueprints. We're going to the sinkhole. If they want Goliath, they're going to have to go through us first," Noah Brian said, grabbing the old man's arm. "If we go out there, we might not come back." Noah smiled a grim, toothy grin that reminded Brian of a wolf. "Son, I've been waiting 50 years to see if that damn machine actually works. Let's go kick the tires." Noah's 1985 Ford F-150 roared across the west pasture, its suspension groaning as it slammed through ditches and mud. Brian gripped the dashboard, the brass cylinder clutched tightly in his other hand. Through the rear window, the sky was stained a violent orange. The north barn was fully engulfed in flames, a pyre meant to signal the end of the Bennett legacy. "They'll see us," Brian shouted over the engine's whine. "Let them look at the fire," Noah yelled back, killing the headlights as they approached the sinkhole. "They think you're running scared. They don't know we're running to something." The truck skidded to a halt at the edge of the sinkhole, a depressed acre of land known for swallowing cattle and perpetually holding fog. Noah grabbed a heavy flashlight and a spade from the truck bed. He didn't hesitate, wading into the waist-high muck toward a cluster of gnarled dead oaks. "Dig here," Noah commanded, pointing to a depression between the roots. Between the trees, Brian drove the spade into the wet earth. He dug with the frantic energy of a man fighting for his life, flinging heavy clots of mud over his shoulder. 2 feet down, the spade hit something solid. Clang. It wasn't a rock. It was steel. They scraped away the muck to reveal a heavy industrial wheel set into a concrete collar, a hatch like something from a submarine or a Cold War silo. "Get it open!" Noah barked, racking his shotgun. "I see headlights on the ridge." Brian gripped the rusted wheel. He roared, channeling every ounce of frustration from the last 90 days into his muscles. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air that had been trapped since 1971. He heaved the hatch open, revealing a dark shaft and a ladder plunging into the earth. They scrambled down, pulling the heavy steel lid shut, just as high beams swept across the swamp above. Noah clicked on his flashlight. They were 30 feet underground, in a space that smelled of ozone and preserved history. At the bottom, the beam of light revealed a cavernous concrete chamber, and in the center, resting like a sleeping giant, was Goliath. It was breathtaking. The machine was the size of a locomotive, a complex architecture of copper coils, massive turbine blades, and polished steel pistons. It didn't look like modern technology. It looked like a masterpiece of retro-futuristic engineering built to last 1,000 years. The geothermal tap goes down another 2 miles, Noah's voice echoed in the vast silence. It pulls heat from the crust. But without the regulator core, it's just a statue. He pointed to an empty circular port on the turbine housing. Brian ran to the machine. He unscrewed the cap of the brass cylinder and slid the heavy inner rod, the core, out. It shimmered with a faint, iridescent blue light. He guided it into the port. It locked into place with a satisfying mechanical thunk. Boom! The bunker shook. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "They're blowing the hatch," Noah shouted, aiming his shotgun up the shaft. "Brian." "The key, turn it on." Brian located the ignition slot next to the core. He jammed the tubular key in. It wouldn't turn. "It's locked," Brian screamed. It's a sequence. Noah fired a warning shot up the shaft as ropes dropped down and tactical boots appeared on the ladder. "Check the blueprints." Brian unrolled the yellowed papers on the concrete floor, squinting in the flashlight's beam. His finger traced the schematic. "Safety override. Left 180. Push. Right 90. Noah Miller." The leader's voice boomed down the shaft, distorted and angry. "Step away from the machine. We have C4 charges on the ceiling. We will bury you both. You blow the roof. You destroy the prize," Noah yelled back. "Brian, do it now." Mercenaries were sliding down the ropes, their laser sights dancing on the machinery. Brian didn't look up. He grabbed the key with both hands. He twisted it left. Click. He pushed it in. Thunk. He twisted it right. Clack. For a second, there was silence. Then a low moan began deep in the earth, like a whale song rising from the abyss. The copper coils began to glow. The air in the room suddenly felt charged, the hairs on Brian's arms standing up. The ground didn't just shake, it thrummed with infinite power. Goliath was awake. The turbine spun. It wasn't a mechanical grind, but a hum that vibrated in the marrow of Brian's bones. The Goliath prototype didn't just turn on. It inhaled. The bunker flooded with blinding blue light. Above them, the mercenaries rappelling down screamed as the sheer electromagnetic force repelled them like magnets, sending them scrambling back up the ropes in terror. Its stable Noah roared over the sound of infinite torque. 500 megawatts. "Brian, it's alive." A pillar of ionized light shot up the shaft, piercing the night sky like a beacon. It cut through the smoke of the burning barn, illuminating the entire valley for miles. Up on the surface, Ray Bennett watched his victory evaporate. The ground shook beneath his feet. His mercenaries fled into the darkness, abandoning him as the sirens approached. It wasn't just the fire department coming for the barn. The Oakhaven beam had drawn every state trooper within 50 miles. By the time Brian and Noah climbed out of the hatch, the area was swarming with law enforcement. Ray was already in handcuffs, screaming at the sheriff. "This is my land." Ray spat his expensive suit ruined by mud. "That machine is a fixture of the property. I own the deed. I own the dirt. I own the machine." "Actually," Brian said, stepping into the circle of police lights. He held up the oily blueprints and the brass key. "You don't." The crowd quieted. Brian looked at his cousin with cold satisfaction. "Grandpa's will was specific, Ray. You got the liquid assets. I got the contents of the North Barn, specifically the Massey Ferguson." He held up the glowing core key. The heart of this machine, the patent, the core, the invention was inside that tractor. It's not a fixture of the land. It's the content of the barn. Ray went pale. The loophole was ironclad. He had traded $1 billion legacy for a quick cash payout. The legal battle was short. With the viral footage of the beam and the clear terms of the will, Vanguard Systems backed off, leaving Ray to face arson charges alone. The Bennett farm didn't just survive, it evolved. The Goliath reactor now powers the entire county, selling surplus energy back to the grid to fund local agriculture. Brian didn't become a tycoon in a suit. He kept farming, though the work is easier now that electricity is free. And in the lobby of the new energy center built over the sinkhole, there is a special exhibit. It's not the high-tech reactor people come to see first. It's the rusted, beat-up 1978 Massey Ferguson 285. A small bronze plaque sits in front of it, worthless to some, priceless to those who know where to look. Brian Bennett could have taken the easy way out. He could have sold the land, paid his debts, and let his grandfather's legacy be paved over for a parking lot. But he chose to fight for the one thing everyone else called worthless. He didn't just find a machine. He found the truth about his family. Grandpa Earl didn't leave him a broken tractor to punish him. He left it because he knew Brian was the only one with the patience, the grit, and the hands to fix what was broken and reveal the power hidden inside. In a world that tells us to throw away the old, the broken, and the difficult, the story of the Bennett farm reminds us that true value isn't always on the surface. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to find it. What about you? Have you ever held on to something everyone else told you to throw away, only to find out it was valuable later? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Let's see who has the best trash to treasure moment. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.